The Mafia boss's son just announced, "I'm your new roommate." I hadn't even processed what that sentence meant when Dante Moretti was already standing right in front of me, dangerously handsome, dragging along dozens of boxes and a line of bodyguards clogging the dorm hallway. No one asked permission. No one explained. They all moved like I belonged under their jurisdiction. "Move," one of the guards said coldly, pushing lightly at my shoulder to clear the way so Dante could step into my room like he'd owned the place all along. Dante looked straight at me, his eyes so cold I had to swallow hard. "You don't understand," he said, voice low like he was trying to keep a secret. "But if I'm not here, you'll be the first one to die." I jerked back. "What? Why me?" Dante didn't answer right away. He just took one step closer, close enough to make me forget how to breathe. "Because the man hunting me has already found this campus," he said slowly. "And he just watched you open the door for me." My hands started shaking. The only question left in my head was, why the hell is my life tangled up with a mafia prince? Maybe this is the right time to say the important part. I'm Lila Torres. I'm standing there, feeling the cheap, thin wood of the dorm room door digging into my back. And I'm staring at this man whose suit probably cost more than my entire tuition. And all I can think is, this is really happening. This wasn't some movie or a bad dream. This was a Tuesday afternoon, and my life was officially over, just like that. I'm a vet student, right? I work 3 shifts a week at a coffee shop and live on instant noodles just to make rent. I don't do danger, I don't do drama, and I certainly don't do handsome men who come with armed security details. My whole plan was to graduate, pay off my loans, and maybe open a small rescue clinic someday. And now I'm standing in a shooting gallery because this guy decided my humble, barely functional dorm room was the perfect place for a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. The sheer absurdity of it, the way my simple, struggling life was being completely derailed by this sudden, overwhelming presence, it was just a lot. I felt the heat rising in my face. Not from fear yet, but from a kind of deep, frustrating disbelief that the universe had decided to dump its biggest, most expensive problem right into my cramped, poorly lit corner of the world. I took a deep breath, trying to push the sheer panic down, trying to remind myself that even though I was small and maybe easy to overlook, I wasn't fragile. I was just really, really annoyed, and I needed to figure out how to reclaim my space and my sanity, even if the man standing in front of me looked like he could single-handedly shut down the entire country if he felt like it. And look, I know this is a heavy story, and honestly sometimes telling it feels like reliving it all over again, but I promise we'll get through it together. That's kind of the point of sharing these things, right? Just taking a quick second here before we dive into the total, absolute chaos that became my life. If this story is already grabbing you, maybe pause for just a moment, open up your phone, and hit the like button for me. It really helps me share these stories with more people who might need to hear them, people who've been overlooked, you know? And seriously, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, or what your gut feeling is about this whole situation. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel. That little click really means the world to me, and it's the only way you'll know when I post the next part of this wild ride. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here with me. Now, let's get back to the moment where the actual trouble started, because it got so much worse before it got better. I just stood there, speechless, while Dante took another step back and gave the room a long, slow scan, and the look on his face wasn't curiosity or even mild surprise. It was pure, unadulterated disdain, like he'd accidentally stepped in something sticky and expensive that he couldn't wait to scrape off his shoe. "This place," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding both bored and insulted, "is unbelievably awful, and you are not Jade." He said the name Jade like it was supposed to mean something to me, like I should have known who she was and why he was expecting her. And the whole time he was speaking, he didn't even look at me again, focusing instead on the peeling paint near the ceiling. I felt a defensive sting, because yeah, it was an awful room. But it was my awful room, and I was paying for it with coffee-stained minimum wage money, and this stranger had absolutely no right to judge my humble little life. I crossed my arms, trying to look bigger than my 5'4" frame would allow, and I tried to be the voice of reason in this completely unreasonable situation, because someone had to be. I told him flatly, my voice completely steady, "I don't know who Jade is, and I don't care how bad you think my room is. You've got the wrong address, pretty boy. I'm Lila, and I'm not your new roommate. Now you and your little army need to get your things and get out." I could hear the whispering starting outside, right through the thin drywall, because the hallway was absolutely jammed with his people, and I could feel the eyes of every student on the floor boring into my back, judging the scene like it was a cheap reality show. It was one of those old, U-shaped dormitories where every window faced the courtyard, so everyone knew everybody else's business. And the low status of my situation, already a known quantity, the perpetually broke vet student, was suddenly being broadcast with a massive, amplified spotlight that I couldn't escape. One of the guys in the hall, a tall, loud kid named Brad, who always seemed to carry a grudge against anyone who wasn't born rich, actually yelled out, "Lila's picked up another scam boyfriend, hasn't she? Looks more like a criminal than a student, Torres." And I just clenched my jaw, hating the instant, bitter assumption, the way they instantly jumped to the idea that the only way a girl like me could attract a guy like him was through some kind of transactional, desperate arrangement where I gave up my dignity. Dante, meanwhile, acted like the entire hallway was invisible, pulling a sleek silver phone from his jacket pocket and muttering something sharp and rapid in Italian, which only made Brad's comment about him looking like a criminal feel terrifyingly accurate and somehow more real than I wanted to admit. Then, before I could push the door closed, one of the massive bodyguards, trying to maneuver a heavy, leather-bound trunk into the doorway, accidentally swung it too wide and caught the corner of my rickety little particle board desk, which I'd thrifted for $20 last summer. The desk, unable to handle the impact, tipped over instantly. And all my textbooks, my worn copy of veterinary anatomy, my pencils, and worst of all, my precious emergency stash of ramen noodle packets, went flying everywhere, scattering across the threadbare carpet in a sudden, messy disaster that perfectly mirrored the state of my mental health in that exact moment. The bodyguard mumbled a quick, automated apology, not even stopping to help, and then he and two others just kept shoving their boxes and their expensive, intimidating presence into the tiny room, effectively taking over every single available inch of space, leaving me literally boxed into the corner. Dante finally lowered his phone, his eyes still glacier cold as he watched me scramble to pick up my things, trying to save the packets of soup before they got crushed under a designer boot. And the pity in his expression was worse than the disdain he'd shown earlier. "Jade Sinclair was your previous occupant," he stated flatly, finally addressing the original confusion, completely ignoring the mayhem his people had just caused and the scattered wreckage of my student life. "She suddenly moved out 2 days ago, and my people secured the lease as Lila Torres had already signed documents agreeing to a roommate transfer." He paused, stepping over a pile of my scattered notes without a hint of apology, and the smell of his expensive cologne completely overwhelmed the faint, comforting aroma of stale coffee and disinfectant that usually defined my living space, making it feel alien and suffocating. "You see, no one would look here. No one would expect the son of Alessio Moretti to be hiding in a place where the air conditioning sounds like a dying whale and the carpet is a hazard." He didn't even bother to lower his voice for the last part. He just dropped the name, Alessio Moretti, like I should instantly recoil in terror or reverence, which I didn't, because I was still too busy trying to uncrush my beef-flavored ramen. I realized with a sudden, sinking dread that the official paperwork he mentioned, the one that made him my legitimate legal roommate, was probably signed under duress or fabricated entirely. Another piece of evidence of the kind of raw, silent power these people wielded. The kind that could just steamroll over a student's lease agreement without a second thought. And I felt small. Not because of my height, but because I suddenly understood the sheer scale of the machine that was rolling over me. A machine that saw my existence as nothing more than a convenient, disposable piece of camouflage. Over the next few days, the chaos didn't abate. It simply became the new, terrifying normal, a heavy, expensive blanket smothering my simple life, making every hour feel like an intrusion. Dante had claimed the half of the room with the slightly larger window and the least squeaky bed, marking his territory with trunks that looked like they contained gold bars and suits that were clearly tailor-made in Italy. While I was squeezed into a corner that now felt less like a bedroom and more like a poorly organized storage unit. One evening, I was attempting to study for my parasitology exam, hunched over my textbooks, when Dante took a phone call. He stepped out into the hallway first, clearly trying to find some privacy. But the heavy Italian that spilled from his mouth carried easily through the thin door, hitting me with a sudden, cold jolt that I couldn't ignore. I didn't speak Italian, but the tension in his voice, the low, dangerous rumble that sounded like grinding gears, didn't need translation. And I caught two names, two words that ripped through the thin fabric of my denial: Kirov and Warzone. He wasn't talking about a bad grade or a football rivalry. He was speaking with an urgency and a tone of command that belonged to serious, life-or-death decisions, ending the call with a venomous whisper that I instantly understood. If Kirov finds me, this entire university becomes a war zone. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy, confirming every dark suspicion I'd suppressed since the moment his massive black trunks appeared in my life, and I felt the reality of my predicament crystallize into a single, terrifying point. I was sharing a room with a hunted man, and his hunters were not playing games, and this was not just a protective program. It was a life-or-death confrontation that I was now inexplicably a part of. That night, my sleep was practically non-existent, filled with the fear that the war zone Dante mentioned would start right outside our door, or worse, right inside the room. So the next morning, fueled by desperation and 3 cups of bad coffee, I decided I'd had enough and marched straight down to the dorm manager's office, feeling a surge of defiant student power. Mr. Henderson was a small, fussy man, usually very proud of his petty authority over broken vending machines and noise complaints, and I intended to lay out the entire insane situation, starting with the unapproved roommate transfer and ending with the veiled threats of violence and the 24-hour presence of armed bodyguards who were terrifying the entire floor. I actually got as far as, "Mr. Henderson, I have a massive problem with my new roommate, Dante." When I saw him, Dante standing on the other side of the small, cramped office, leaning casually against the water cooler, looking every bit the lethal prince of darkness he was, and Mr. Henderson, the man who once gave me a lecture for leaving a mug in the sink, suddenly straightened up like a terrified butler who'd just spotted royalty. I watched, mouth hanging open in complete disbelief, as the manager practically folded himself in half, bowing his head deeply as he murmured something deferential to Dante, in a tone I'd never heard him use before. A tone of absolute, total subservience that chilled me to the bone. Dante just offered a curt, dismissive nod, looking through Mr. Henderson like he was a pane of dirty glass, and then he turned his ice-cold gaze on me, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow as if to ask, "Did you really think that would work, little mouse?" I immediately dropped the subject, mumbled something about a keycard issue, and backed out of the office feeling 100 times smaller and infinitely more exposed, realizing that Dante's reach extended far beyond the campus grounds, weaving its expensive, silent threads right into the supposedly legitimate administration, which meant there was truly no authority I could appeal to. The incident with the manager only cemented the fact that I couldn't trust anyone, and the next moment that shattered my already shaky grip on reality happened late that same night, around 3 a.m., adding a horrifying new layer to my understanding of the man. I'd woken up needing water, and, as I stumbled toward the tiny, shared kitchenette, I noticed the door to our room was slightly ajar, which was unusual, given Dante's paranoia and his security team's meticulousness. I paused, hearing a quiet, rhythmic sound coming from inside. Not a nightmare this time, but a steady, almost clinical snip, snip, snip. And curiosity, that terrible, fatal flaw that always gets the innocent in trouble, won out over common sense. I crept back in, and the sight that greeted me froze the blood in my veins. Dante was sitting cross-legged on the floor, leaning against the wall, his expensive white button-down shirt pulled back to expose a deep, ragged-looking wound just above his rib cage, and he was calmly stitching it closed himself. There was no pain, no grimace, just a detached, terrifying focus as he pulled the needle and thread through his own flesh. The faint, metallic scent of fresh blood filling the small, suffocating space. I must have made a sound, a small, choked gasp, because his head snapped up instantly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, dangerous intensity. But instead of panicking or lashing out, he simply looked down, pulled the thread one last time, snipped it, and tucked the needle away into a small black leather kit. He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask, but the implication was clear. He was living a life where self-surgery was just part of the nightly routine, a world where bullet holes were as common and expected as a bad cold, and the cold efficiency of his self-care was a chilling testament to the life he'd been forced to lead. I watched him slowly pull his blood-stained shirt back over his torso, and I couldn't help but notice the lean, hard definition of his body, realizing he wasn't just dangerous because of his name, but because he was physically, lethally capable. A weapon dressed in designer clothes, and that cold focus he applied to his wound was probably the same focus he applied to everything he did. The bodyguards, those massive, silent men who filled the hallway and turned the atmosphere of our cozy little campus into one of perpetual, low-grade menace, only reinforced this truth, especially since they'd started parking their black SUVs outside the main dormitory entrance every single night, turning the courtyard into a kind of heavily fortified, mobile fortress that was impossible to miss. The whole campus was in an uproar. Students were simultaneously terrified and morbidly fascinated, and I knew every single one of them was drawing the same conclusion. Something illegal, something huge, is happening right there, in Lila Torres's room, and the entire situation felt like a pressure cooker, the heat rising with every passing hour. The worst moment of all came the morning after the stitching incident, when Dante looked at me across the cluttered table, his expression completely devoid of warmth, his eyes cold and distant, and stated, his words measured and final, crushing my last desperate hope of extricating myself from the mess. "I'm not just your roommate, I'm your responsibility now. If I die, they'll assume you helped Kirov, and they won't hesitate to come after you and every single person you care about. Your life is collateral, Lila, and you will stay put until this is over." Life with a Mafia prince turned out to be an exercise in constant, suffocating humiliation, the kind that chipped away at my self-worth every single day until I felt like I was made of dust, always struggling to justify my existence in the face of overwhelming judgment. The spatial distribution was the first and most immediate source of psychological distress. Dante, with his extravagant needs, had somehow managed to occupy what felt like 80% of our already cramped 150-square-foot room, his sleek, modern furniture and enormous wardrobe pieces essentially pushing my sad little corner into complete insignificance. He had a massive, imported espresso machine on what used to be my only bookshelf. His heavy leather briefcase sat permanently on my desk chair, and I was left with a depressing, tiny sliver of space next to the bathroom door, barely large enough for my twin bed and a sad stack of textbooks, making me feel like an insignificant squatter in my own life, always navigating around his luxurious obstacles. Every morning, the spectacle repeated itself. The roar of luxury engines, Porsches, Bentleys, sometimes even a Rolls-Royce, blasting onto the quiet academic pathways of the campus, screeching to a halt right outside the dorm to either drop off or pick up Dante's endless rotation of mysterious, impeccably dressed visitors and bodyguards. My classmates, watching this theatrical display from their windows and the cafeteria, naturally assumed the worst, whispering loudly enough for me to hear in every lecture hall that I must have become some rich guy's sugar baby, trading my dignity and my supposed poverty for access to his expensive world. The humiliation only escalated when the students, particularly a nasty group led by a perpetually bored theater major, started actively live-streaming outside our window, setting up their phones on tripods because the rumor mill had decided Dante was some kind of celebrity or a famous, disgraced politician hiding out in the dorms. The tags on the streams, which inevitably found their way back to me, were cruel and inventive. Poor girl Mafia bait, Dante the disgraced, Vet student turns gold digger, turning my attempts at keeping a low profile into a massive, unavoidable campus joke. I tried to ignore it, burying my nose in my textbooks, pretending I couldn't hear the giggling and the commentary. But the constant, invasive scrutiny was exhausting, making every walk across the quad feel like a public perp walk under the judgmental eyes of my entire peer group. The darkest comedic aspect of our shared existence, however, always played out during mealtime. A stark, painful contrast between his world and mine that crystallized the disparity between us in the most embarrassing way possible. I would be hunched over my bowl of instant noodles, the savory steam rising up to fog my glasses, carefully nursing the cheap, sodium-laden meal when Dante would be on his phone, casually discussing logistics for a 3-course, catered meal being delivered to the library. Or sometimes, he would just sit and watch me, silent and utterly judgmental. He didn't say anything the first few times, just observed me with that unsettling mix of disbelief and detached pity. His beautiful face marred by a flicker of confusion that made me feel like I was a bizarre, exotic creature he'd found under a rock. Finally, one night, as I was adding a sad, solitary hard-boiled egg to my meager cup of spicy chicken ramen, he just leaned back in his chair, crossed one arm over his chest, and asked, his voice completely devoid of malice but dripping with an accidental, devastating cruelty. "Are you really this poor, Lila? I mean, structurally, logically, I understand that people have less, but this is a strategic choice, isn't it? No one willingly subjects themselves to this kind of diet, especially when I could arrange a meal plan for you in 5 minutes." His question, simple and direct, felt like a punch to the gut. Not because I was ashamed of being poor, but because he framed my struggling existence as a baffling, almost artistic choice, something utterly foreign to his worldview of limitless resources. I simply met his gaze, scooped up a mouthful of noodles, and swallowed before answering him with the same flat, honest tone I used whenever I spoke to him. "It's not a choice, Dante. It's reality. And some of us can't just order the world we want to appear on our doorstep, no matter how much money is in the bank." I didn't elaborate. I didn't apologize. I just kept eating. But the moment hung heavy between us, a stark reminder that we existed on 2 completely separate planes of reality, and his inability to grasp my struggle was a wall between us. The humiliation, however, often gave way to outright terror, especially late at night when Dante's trauma would surface, a raw, violent eruption of the world he was trying to hide from, reminding me that I was living next to a caged animal. He was quiet, always controlled during the day, but at night, the nightmares would come. Deep, guttural sounds of distress mixed with sharp, physical violence. And one particular night, I was jolted awake by the splintering crack of wood. I opened my eyes in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw Dante's shadow struggling against the flimsy old wardrobe, which he had, in his sleep, completely destroyed, tearing the door right off its hinges with a shocking burst of strength. The sound was deafening in the tiny room, and for a terrifying moment I truly thought I was about to be killed, that Kirov had somehow breached the security detail, and that I was about to be caught in the crossfire of some violent final confrontation. I huddled under my thin blanket, shaking, waiting for the attack, only to realize Dante was sitting up, breathing heavily, his face pale and slick with sweat, staring at the damage he had done with a look of pure, unadulterated self-loathing. He didn't apologize for breaking the cheap furniture. He didn't even acknowledge that I was awake. But in that silent, terrified moment, I understood that the violence he carried wasn't always directed outward. It was something buried deep inside him, a constant, consuming threat that made him a danger not just to his enemies, but to himself. And now, by proximity, to me, forcing me to recognize the depth of his internal suffering. The undeniable intimacy born from the shared terror and his unexpected protection only made the outside world's mockery sting even more sharply, compounding the humiliation and turning my life into a constant, whispered spectacle. The turning point, the moment where the dynamic shifted from reluctant roommates to something far more complicated, happened one afternoon as I was walking back from my microbiology lab, clutching my notes and trying to avoid eye contact with the smirking students loitering near the dorm entrance. A group of girls, led by a particularly sharp-tongued drama major named Chloe, intercepted me near the water fountain, their expressions a mixture of smug superiority and vicious entitlement. And Chloe started the verbal assault immediately, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Lila, honey, you look exhausted," she chirped, the fake concern in her voice a thin veil for the cruelty beneath. "Is it hard work, keeping the Mafia prince happy? We were just saying how sad it is that you have to use your physical assets to pay for your education. Maybe you should spend less time servicing your rich boyfriend and more time actually studying for that vet degree you'll never use." The other girls snickered, closing ranks around me, making me feel utterly cornered. And the accusation, that ugly, persistent rumor of me seducing Dante for money, felt like a physical blow, a complete dismissal of my hard work and integrity. I felt the familiar heat of anger rising, but before I could formulate a calm, measured response, a sudden, icy stillness descended upon the hallway, and I heard a voice that made the blood instantly drain from Chloe's face. Dante had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, dressed in a sharp, dark gray suit, his presence radiating an almost palpable, lethal stillness that made the air feel thick and heavy. And his eyes, usually just cold, were now focused on Chloe with an intensity that promised immediate, irrevocable violence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply walked up, placing himself squarely between me and the group of terrified girls, and then he delivered one single, clean, ice-cold sentence that sliced through the noisy hall like a stiletto blade. "Touch her again, or speak her name again in this manner, and I promise you, you will disappear without a trace. Not metaphorically, actually disappear." The threat wasn't delivered with heat or passion. It was a simple, flat statement of fact, a promise of inevitable consequence, and the effect was immediate and total. Chloe and her entire giggling cohort bolted, scattering down the hall in a collective spasm of pure, primal terror, leaving their expensive lattes and their malicious gossip behind. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, and for the first time since he arrived, I felt a flicker of something other than fear toward Dante, a grudging, complicated respect for the man who was willing to draw a line in the sand for me. That night, after the immediate adrenaline rush had faded, I found him in the room, doing push-ups on the floor, and I finally broke the tension by thanking him, though the word felt inadequate for the service he'd just rendered. He stopped, sat back on his heels, and just looked at me for a long time, his gaze searching, almost vulnerable, which was a look I'd never seen on his face before, and it made the air in the room suddenly thick with unacknowledged feeling. "You need to learn how to defend yourself, Lila," he said, not as a suggestion, but as an order, standing up and moving toward me. "My protection won't always be fast enough. Relying on me is relying on chance, and in my world, chance is death." He spent the next hour teaching me the absolute basics: how to shift my weight, how to make a fist that didn't break my knuckles, and how to use my elbows in close quarters. It was a bizarre, intimate lesson, conducted in the oppressive heat of our tiny dorm room, and I was hyper-aware of his proximity, the lean strength of his body, and the way his fingers, usually so stiff and cold, would close around my wrist just enough to correct my posture, sending a completely unwanted, inconvenient spiral of warmth through my stomach. It was during a pause while I was catching my breath that he confessed, his voice dropping so low it was barely audible, a private admission meant only for me, exposing a flicker of his guarded soul. "You're the first person who isn't afraid of me, Lila. Everyone else, my father, my men, those pathetic students, they all see the title or the threat. But you just see the unwelcome roommate, the obstacle to your life. That complicates things, because it makes me want to protect you for reasons other than just survival." His words, honest and surprising, opened a new, fragile crack in the wall between us, and the complication he spoke of became terrifyingly real only a few nights later, when the threat he'd been running from finally breached the campus security perimeter. I was studying late when the alarm on Dante's phone, a low, buzzing pulse, went off. And instantly, he was awake and moving, his movements silent and impossibly fast. Before I could even ask what was wrong, a massive, shadowy figure materialized in the doorway. A hitman sent by Kirov, his face obscured, his hand reaching for the weapon tucked into his waistband. The next 10 seconds were a blur of fluid, brutal motion. Dante didn't grab a gun, didn't use a knife. He used the only thing he had close to hand, a simple, number 2 pencil that had been resting on my desk, the very desk his guard had knocked over. He moved with a horrifying, focused grace, closing the distance in a single step. And before the hitman could even draw his weapon, Dante had disabled him, using the ordinary writing implement with a precision that was both sickening and mesmerizing. A terrifying, instant takedown that left the man crumpled and groaning silently on the floor. Dante just stood there, breathing evenly, looking down at the defeated assassin with the same detached, clinical expression he'd worn while stitching his own wound. The sight of that casual, efficient violence, the way he could turn an office supply into a lethal weapon, finally drove home the magnitude of his reality. And as he stood there, wiping a speck of blood from his cuff, I realized with a painful certainty, he wasn't just my roommate. He was a walking, breathing executioner. And I, the struggling vet student, was slowly, foolishly, becoming his only anchor in a world of chaos. The sheer terror of living with a walking time bomb, combined with the constant, grinding social humiliation, nearly broke me. But it also forced a strange, tense bond between us, a kind of shared, reluctant awareness that we only had each other in that bizarre, hostile environment. The rumors escalated from simple gold digging to something far more sinister. The whole campus was now abuzz with the theory that Lila is living with the Mafia heir in exchange for tuition, a persistent narrative that painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had leveraged my poverty and proximity to secure a financial arrangement with the powerful Moretti family, completely dismissing my integrity. It wasn't just the students anymore. The administration caught wind of the escalating chaos, and one Tuesday afternoon, I was called into Professor Olson's office, my stomach already churning with dread. Professor Olson, head of the pre-vet program and a man whose approval I desperately craved, sat behind his desk, his usually warm expression replaced by one of cold, professional disappointment. He didn't accuse me directly, but he questioned me relentlessly, using cold, detached bureaucratic language about disrupting the academic environment, creating an unmanageable security liability, and the need to maintain the integrity of the university's reputation. I tried to explain, to offer a rational defense of my bizarre living situation, but my words felt weak and unbelievable even to my own ears, and I left his office feeling not just humiliated, but professionally compromised, realizing that the Moretti chaos was now threatening the only thing that actually mattered to me, my future as a veterinarian. The pressure cooker really began to boil over when my old roommate, Jade Sinclair, the person whose sudden, mysterious disappearance had actually created this entire, catastrophic situation, reappeared on campus, strolling into the cafeteria with a casual, almost proprietorial air. I watched her from across the room, noting the expensive new clothes and the almost aggressively confident posture, and immediately I knew something was wrong. She didn't look like a student who'd simply dropped out. She looked like someone who had been repositioned, and her presence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She approached me the next day, right as I was leaving my final class, and the malice in her eyes was unmistakable, thinly disguised by a sickly sweet smile as she accused me, right in front of a dozen eavesdropping students, of stealing her man. She claimed Dante was hers, that I had used her abrupt departure as an opportunity to worm my way into his life and his money, and she acted with such convincing, theatrical outrage that several onlookers actually started murmuring their sympathy for her. I simply stood there, meeting her gaze, not allowing her lies to draw a single reaction from me, but the sting of her betrayal, the fact that she had returned not to apologize for leaving me in this mess, but to try and reclaim Dante and further destroy my reputation, fueled a cold, calculating resolve in me that pushed me into action. The final public indignity happened a week later, solidifying my status as the campus joke and Dante's mistress when one of the massive bodyguards, an intimidating man named Marco, made a critical slip-up in front of an entire class of my classmates. I was waiting for Dante outside the main library entrance, just standing awkwardly by myself, when Marco approached, holding a large, important-looking folder. And instead of addressing me by my name or simply offering the folder, he leaned in and, in a low, respectful murmur that was unfortunately loud enough for the 4 girls standing next to me to hear, called me Madam. The word, Madam, dropped into the sterile academic environment like a massive, expensive brick, instantly confirming every ridiculous, untrue rumor about my relationship with Dante. It suggested a level of formality, ownership, and recognized status that only the wife or official partner of a high-ranking Mafia figure would possess. The girls immediately burst into a chorus of shocked, delighted gasps, their eyes wide with judgment and envy, and I felt my face flush crimson, the blood rushing hot to my cheeks. But I simply took the folder, thanked Marco with a neutral tone, and walked away, refusing to let the incident draw any more attention than it already had. But the true, suffocating weight of Dante's world, the one that truly terrified and humiliated me, was something I kept entirely to myself. A secret piece of knowledge that changed everything. It happened when I was finally, meticulously organizing the mountain of Dante's expensive belongings, trying to find some semblance of order in the chaos, and I came across a small, leather-bound notebook tucked deep inside one of his custom-made locked boxes. Curiosity, combined with the desperate need to understand the man I was inexplicably bound to, overcame my better judgment, and I carefully leveraged a thin piece of metal from one of my dissection kits to pick the lock. A small act of rebellion, an attempt to reclaim some power and knowledge. Inside the notebook, written in Dante's precise, elegant Italian script, was not a journal or financial accounts, but a list, a chronological accounting of names, locations, and dates. And the cold, horrifying realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a list of people he had had to kill, a stark, terrifying record of his life's deadly duties, and the sheer volume of names, the methodical nature of the documentation, turned my stomach to ice, confirming that he was a trained killer, and the discovery of that ledger, that final, undeniable proof of the violence that stained his hands, was the deepest humiliation of all. The painful, terrifying truth that I was growing dangerously attached to a man whose very existence was death. A man who lived outside the moral laws I held dear. The moment I looked at that list, the one filled with names and dates, something shifted inside me. The fear was still there, a constant, low-frequency hum, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, surgical clarity, a need to protect myself and my future that overcame all the terror and shame. I knew, with an absolute certainty that required no proof, that Jade's sudden reappearance and her theatrical hostility were not about a stolen boyfriend. They were about Kirov, the Russian enemy Dante was running from, and Jade was the mole, the traitor who had orchestrated the entire disappearance to create a vacancy for Dante, knowing his father would choose the last place anyone would look. I realized that my poverty, my insignificance, was actually my greatest weapon, because no one, certainly not Dante and definitely not Jade, would ever suspect the quiet, overlooked girl of being capable of any kind of serious, strategic countermove. I didn't tell Dante what I suspected. The secret, the knowledge that I was the one person who saw the true threat, was my only advantage, and I knew that if I told him, he would only see me as a liability to be protected, further silencing my agency and keeping me on the sidelines. Instead, I set a meticulous, silent trap, an act of intellectual rebellion that required every bit of the quiet focus I usually reserved for dissecting small animals in the lab. I spent a frantic, sleepless night in the library, using the skills I'd picked up fixing broken electronics for extra cash, setting up tiny, high-definition recording devices disguised as thumb drives and USB wall chargers, planting them strategically throughout our dorm room, focusing especially on the small kitchenette area. It was an enormous risk, a direct and dangerous confrontation with Dante's world, but I had reached the point where I preferred confrontation over waiting to be caught in the inevitable explosion. I also used my meager savings to run a silent background check on Jade Sinclair, cross-referencing her known addresses and recent activity with the dark web contacts I'd found in Dante's hidden files, confirming that her sudden wealth and her timeline of movement lined up perfectly with Kirov's known associates. The whole setup was a painful, exhausting gambit, and I had to maintain a facade of complete normalcy, continuing to slurp my ramen and pretend I was solely focused on my vet studies, while inside, I was a coiled spring waiting for the betrayer to strike, knowing that one false move would expose me to the same danger as Dante. The wait was mercifully short. Jade, intoxicated by her own perceived cleverness and the belief that I was too stupid or insignificant to notice her, made her move just 2 nights later. Dante was out for a clandestine meeting with one of his father's underlings, and Jade, using a key she must have kept, snuck into our room. I was strategically sleeping through the entire scene, but the hidden camera footage captured every single damning, horrifying detail. She went straight to Dante's untouched glass of water on the nightstand, pulled out a small, clear vial from the lining of her expensive coat, and carefully, deliberately emptied its contents into the glass, stirring it once with the tip of her perfectly manicured finger. The evidence was irrefutable, a clear, unmistakable attempt to poison him, and the chilling, triumphant smirk she wore as she left the room confirmed the depths of her betrayal. My hands were shaking as I transferred the footage to a secure drive, but the fear was mixed with a powerful, invigorating sense of control. I, Leila Torres, the invisible girl, had just caught the enemy that the Moretti's entire sophisticated security apparatus had missed. I didn't send the footage to Dante because I knew he would handle it with immediate, brutal violence that would only escalate the situation further, potentially compromising my safety by drawing unnecessary attention to the room. Instead, I bypassed him entirely, using the encrypted contact information I'd found in his notebook to send the entire chronological file, the background check, and the poison footage directly to the man at the top. Alessio Moretti, Dante's notoriously ruthless, old-world mafia boss father. I attached a simple, anonymous note. "This is the traitor who jeopardized your son." The response wasn't immediate, but it was explosive. The next morning, Dante was gone. His side of the room cleared out entirely, and I was left alone with only the silence and the lingering scent of his expensive cologne. When he finally returned late that evening, he wasn't alone. His father, Alessio, a man whose presence filled the tiny dorm room with terrifying, quiet power, was standing right behind him, his cold, evaluating eyes fixed solely on me. Alessio, after a long, silent assessment that felt like a lifetime under the microscope, finally nodded once, a brief, sharp gesture of acknowledgement, and spoke with a low, gravelly voice that commanded the room. "This girl has nerve. You are safe now, my son. The traitor is handled." He didn't thank me, didn't compliment me, but the simple, grudging admission that I had the nerve to challenge his world and succeed where his own people had failed was a victory more profound than any apology. Jade Sinclair, I later learned, faced the natural, inevitable consequences of betraying a family like the Morettis. She simply vanished from the campus and the face of the earth, her ambition having finally caught up with her in the most permanent way imaginable. Alessio left as abruptly as he arrived, his imposing shadow retreating from my small life, and I was left standing there, breathing the suddenly cleaner air, facing Dante, who now looked at me with a completely different gaze. No longer pity, no longer confusion, but a profound, almost stunned respect that radiated from him like heat. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands resting on the pockets of his impeccable suit, and the silence stretched out between us, thick with unspoken acknowledgments and the recent, shared violence, a space of mutual understanding that had never existed before. He didn't need to ask how I knew or how I did it. The proof was in the fact that Jade was gone and his father was impressed. He walked slowly until he was standing right in front of me, and he reached out, not to touch me, but to simply rest his hand on the top of the desk I had so frantically protected, acknowledging the physical space I occupied, and the gesture felt more intimate than any embrace. His voice was low and rough, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of vulnerability and awe that transformed him from the icy prince into something unexpectedly human. He said, "You're not just my roommate anymore, Lila." And then he corrected himself, the corner of his mouth turning up in the faintest, most genuine half-smile I had ever seen on his face, a smile that broke through his cold facade. "You're my partner. You did what my entire organization failed to do. You are the only person I can truly trust." The word partner was supposed to feel empowering, a declaration of mutual respect earned through high-stakes betrayal and survival. But in the weeks that followed, it became the foundation for a whole new level of quiet, devastating emotional humiliation. Dante, who had previously been a constant, intimidating presence, suddenly started avoiding me, a subtle, painful withdrawal that felt like a betrayal far more personal than Jade's poisoning attempt. He would find excuses to be out of the room, taking his phone calls in the courtyard, studying in the empty lecture halls, or just disappearing for hours under the guise of security patrols. And the distance, the cold, silent void where his presence used to be, was deafening, filling the room with the ghost of the connection we had just forged. I knew the reason, intellectually. He was terrified that the feelings that were obviously developing between us, the strange, intense connection that had blossomed in the shadow of death, would put an even bigger, more centralized target on my back. He was trying to protect me by pushing me away, but the cold shoulder, the deliberate avoidance of my gaze, the way he would walk into the room and act as if I were just a piece of furniture, felt like a slow, painful rejection, a calculated withdrawal that hurt more than any student mockery. The true source of the heartbreak, the moment that confirmed my deepest fears about his long-term intentions, happened on a Tuesday evening when I walked in unexpectedly and heard his voice, tight and strained, on a call with his father, talking about a future that didn't include me. He didn't realize I was standing in the doorway, and his words, delivered with a desperate, self-protective finality, cut me to the core. "I understand, Father," he was saying, his back to me, his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of his duty. "She's an anomaly. She was useful, a good piece of camouflage. But I will not let sentimentality compromise the safety of the organization, or myself. I will leave her. I'll leave her as soon as the situation is completely safe, and Kirov is neutralized. It's the only way to ensure her survival, and mine." The words hung in the air, cold, precise, and utterly devastating, confirming that while I saw him as a partner, he saw me as a temporary shelter, an anomaly to be discarded once the utility ran out, and his own path was clear. My heart didn't shatter. It simply turned into a heavy, dull ache in my chest, a realization of the brutal arithmetic of his life. My survival meant his departure, and my love was a weakness he was determined to excise from his own formidable character. Without a single word, I waited until he was off the phone, and then I calmly walked over to his side of the room, pulled the spare key he'd given me to his personal safe out of my pocket, and placed it gently on his nightstand, pushing it toward him until it rested against his knuckles. I didn't look at him when I spoke, keeping my eyes fixed on the threadbare carpet, but my voice was steady, completely devoid of the hurt that was churning inside me. "I heard you, Dante," I said, my words flat and final, carrying the weight of my resignation. "I don't need someone who's already planning to leave me. You don't get to sacrifice me for my own good either. Consider yourself unburdened. You can go now. I'll be fine." The quiet power of my withdrawal seemed to shock him more than any outburst of anger or tears could have, and he just stared at the key, then at my face, looking like a man who had suddenly realized he'd just thrown away the only lifeline he had, realizing the true cost of his emotional cowardice. His silence, the inability to offer a single, convincing denial, was all the confirmation I needed, and I turned my back to him, picking up my parasitology textbook, creating a cold, impenetrable wall of academic focus to shield myself from the overwhelming pain of his calculated rejection. But the confusion and attachment were obviously mutual, because his attempts to distance himself only led to intense, uncontrolled bouts of jealousy that were both flattering and deeply inconvenient, a physical manifestation of his internal conflict that he couldn't hide. One afternoon, I was walking back from the coffee shop with a fellow vet student named Marcus, a kind, harmless guy who had been patiently helping me with organic chemistry, and we were laughing about a particularly difficult formula when Dante's black SUV, the one with the tinted windows and the perpetually scowling driver, screeched to a halt right next to us. Dante emerged, dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored for war. His jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with a cold, possessive fury that startled Marcus so badly the poor guy nearly dropped his books and scattered his notes all over the sidewalk. Dante didn't speak to Marcus, didn't even look at him. He simply grabbed my arm, his fingers closing around my biceps with a surprising, non-painful firmness, and pulled me wordlessly toward the dorm entrance, leaving Marcus standing there, completely bewildered and utterly terrified. The sheer, violent possessiveness of the act, the way he claimed me in front of everyone, made my heart beat faster. Not from fear, but from the sudden, intoxicating rush of being wanted so fiercely by a man who was terrified to want anyone. But the realization that followed was painful and swift, a cold dash of reality that extinguished the rush. Loving a Mafia prince didn't mean candlelight dinners and safety. It meant living permanently on the border of death. Every day being a high-stakes gamble where the collateral was always my life, always the target for his enemies to exploit. The unspoken tension and painful withdrawal finally climaxed in a terrifying, explosive confrontation that ripped the thin veil of normalcy off my life and dragged our complicated relationship fully into the ruthless spotlight of the underworld. I was leaving the library late one evening, exhausted and alone, when the familiar, sudden sense of wrongness hit me. The air felt too still, the shadows too deep, and before I could even turn around, a massive hand clamped over my mouth, dragging me backward into a waiting, unmarked van. The entire horrifying process was fast, brutal, and silent, and the last thing I heard before the van door slammed shut was the chilling, guttural sound of Russian being spoken just inches from my ear. Kirov had found me, and I knew instantly that Dante's worst fear had been realized. The kidnapping was an immediate, calculated chess move, a devastating strike at Dante's perceived weak spot, and the message Kirov sent him was brutal and simple. A single, high-resolution photo of me, bound and terrified, with a cold, clear ultimatum. Choose, Moretti, the throne or the girl, your father's legacy or your pathetic weakness. Let's see what is truly important to you. Dante didn't hesitate. I learned later, from the breathless reports of his horrified, scrambling subordinates, that the moment he received the picture, all the careful, measured control he had maintained for months shattered completely, replaced by a pure, terrifying need. He didn't call for backup. He didn't wait for his father's authorization or consult the family council. He simply grabbed a gun, strapped a knife to his ankle, and stormed out. A singularity of focused, lethal rage heading straight for the industrial park where Kirov's safe house was located. A ghost in the urban shadows, determined to rescue me alone. His decision was reckless, suicidal even, a complete abandonment of all the careful, strategic planning that had defined his life. And it proved, more than any whispered word or stolen glance, the terrifying depth of his commitment to me. The news of the Moretti heir throwing away his life and his position for a quiet, broke college girl traveled like wildfire through the entire criminal underworld, a scandal that overshadowed every other power play and assassination attempt that year, cementing the fact that I was his biggest vulnerability, but also his only true priority. The rescue itself was less a calculated operation and more a chaotic, cinematic declaration, a complete mobilization of power that had never been seen before in the modern history of the Moretti family. As Dante was fighting his way through the compound, a furious lone warrior taking down Kirov's men with a terrifying, silent efficiency, The sky outside suddenly filled with the roar of engines, not cars but helicopters, and the entire industrial park was instantly surrounded by Alessio Moretti's private army. This was the first time in over 20 years that the underworld had seen the Moretti boss mobilize his entire, formidable military force, not for a territory dispute, not for a rival family, but for me, an ordinary girl, the supposed weakness of his son. Alessio himself was not there, but his authority was palpable, and the sheer scale of the response sent a clear, deafening message. Dante's choice was now the family's choice. I was untied and rushed out, and I remember standing before Kirov, whose face was a mask of furious, disbelieving rage at the failure of his plan, when Dante finally arrived, stepping through the smoke and the chaos, his suit ripped, his face grim, but his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't speak to me. He addressed Kirov directly, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute power that commanded the room, a complete transformation from the sullen, quiet student I thought I knew. "Hurt her, Kirov," Dante declared, standing tall amid the ruined furniture and the stunned faces of the enemy. "And I swear to you I will not just kill you. I will burn your entire empire to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again. She is off limits. She is mine, and the price of touching what is mine is everything you own." It was a statement that was more than a threat. It was a public claim of ownership, a complete, total rejection of the established rules of his world. And then, he simply turned, scooped me up into his arms like I weighed nothing, and carried me out through the smoke and the remaining gunfire, holding me close to his chest, his arms tight around me, moving with a desperate, terrifying urgency, as if he was convinced I would vanish into thin air if he let go for even a second. In that moment, suspended in the chaos and the smoke, with his heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ear, I finally understood that he had chosen me, not just with his words, but with an act of public defiance that had effectively cemented his future, regardless of the devastating consequences. The rescue was the height of our strange, beautiful, and terrifying romance, but the aftermath was the immediate, suffocating weight of reality, a painful consequence that proved that love, in his world, was not a happily ever after, but a perpetual death sentence. I knew, with the clarity of a newly minted survivor, that if I stayed with Dante, my entire life would be spent running, always looking over my shoulder, living on the edge of the blast radius, constantly being used as a bargaining chip by every enemy he ever made. And I realized that my love for him, instead of being a comfort, had become his greatest vulnerability. Sitting in the sterile safety of the hospital room, watching his dark, tired eyes as he slept, I came to the agonizing conclusion that I couldn't be the reason he lost everything, couldn't be the constant target that forced him to choose between his destiny and his desire. When he finally woke up, I met his gaze, and though my heart was breaking, my voice was steady and clear as I said the terrible, necessary words. "You shouldn't choose me, Dante. You can't. This isn't a life for a decent person, and you deserve to be safe, to be free of this." My rejection, delivered after he had literally risked his life and the family's entire military budget for me, caused a complete political and emotional riot within the Italian Mafia factions. The elders and the rival families, who had barely tolerated the idea of the heir choosing an outsider, were furious, believing Dante was abandoning his duty and his bloodline for a worthless, low-status girl who couldn't even commit to him once he risked it all. The pressure on Alessio, his father, became unbearable, a political storm brewing within the dark, powerful core of their world, and the climax of the internal conflict was swift, brutal, and horrifying. Alessio Moretti, the powerful, iron-willed Don, was assassinated in a calculated ambush, a consequence directly resulting from the instability Dante's public act of love had created. The news hit Dante like a physical blow, shattering the small, fragile cocoon of safety we had built, forcing him instantly back into the role he had been trying to escape, the heir who must now become the boss to avenge his father and prevent a complete bloodbath among the remaining factions. The timing was cruel and absolute. His father's death meant Dante was no longer hiding. He was now the undisputed target, the new center of the storm, and the love we shared was the cause of the family's destruction. Dante looked at me then, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of grief, duty, and love, and I could see the agonizing conflict tearing him apart. The love for me, the girl who represented freedom and light, and the crushing, ancient weight of the Moretti name. I knew, with a certainty that burned like acid, that if I stayed, he would be constantly torn, constantly distracted, and eventually, the weight of the throne and the vengeance he owed would consume us both, probably resulting in his death or mine. So, I made the only decision a partner, a true survivor, could make. I decided to leave to protect him, to force him to fulfill the role he was born into, without the constant, deadly liability of my presence, ensuring that his sacrifice for me wasn't ultimately in vain. The goodbye was silent. I simply packed my few pathetic belongings, my textbooks, my ramen, my cheap clothes, while he was at the family compound dealing with the aftermath of the assassination, and I walked out of that tiny, chaotic dorm room and never looked back. I left behind the chaos and the designer clothes, taking only the memory of his hand on my wrist and the desperate sound of his heart beating in the smoke. Believing I was saving his life by breaking my own heart, I was back in my tiny corner of the world, having moved into an even cheaper, dingier apartment on the outskirts of the city, focusing solely on my vet studies and trying to pretend that the last few months had been nothing more than a fever dream, when the news of the succession ceremony reached me. It was all over the international papers, a discreet mention of the new, young, and utterly ruthless Don Moretti, stepping up to take his father's place and consolidate power after the internal turmoil. I saw his picture, cold and formidable, looking every bit the Mafia boss he was born to be, and I felt a wave of relief mixed with profound sorrow, confirming that my sacrifice had worked, that he was safe, in his rightful place, and I was now just a distant, unimportant memory. I sat there, nursing a bowl of instant noodles, watching the rain hit the window, thinking about how that cold man was now ruling an empire, and how I was back to my quiet, unremarkable existence, when the second wave of news broke, shattering the silence I had built around myself. A seismic shift that proved I had completely underestimated the man I loved. The ceremony was supposed to be a private affair, attended only by the 5 families and the old guard, a coronation of power and bloodline. But someone had leaked the details, and the whole underworld was watching, including me, secretly streaming the event on a shaky newsfeed. Dante walked into the massive marble hall, silent and imposing, looking out over the assembled crowd of ruthless men who expected him to claim his birthright and solidify their control over the city. He walked toward the ancient, velvet-covered pedestal, where the Moretti family ring, the symbol of absolute power, rested, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. But instead of picking up the ring and accepting the throne, Dante stopped, took a single, small, humble suitcase, the kind you'd take on a weekend trip, that he had been carrying all along, and placed it gently on the floor. Then, in a moment of utter, unprecedented defiance that stopped the heart of the entire criminal world, he picked up the diamond-encrusted, centuries-old family ring and threw it, not at the council, but onto the cold, unforgiving marble floor, where it bounced once and rolled into the shadows, making a small metallic sound that was louder than any gunshot. His voice, amplified by the stunned silence, was clear and final, echoing through the cavernous hall, a complete rejection of everything he was born to be. I choose her. I choose the life I fought to keep, and I choose the only person I trust. I choose Lila Torres, and that is where the Moretti line ends. The entire Mafia world was completely stunned. No heir, in the recorded history of the Italian families, had ever rejected the throne for love, choosing a simple, common life over the limitless, absolute power that was his birthright. It was a choice that shattered the Moretti family curse, rewriting what it meant to be born a prince in their dark world. And it was the strongest, loudest, most beautiful declaration of love I had ever witnessed. a complete abandonment of duty and title for the sake of his own soul. I was sitting in my small, depressing apartment, still processing the shock of the news, the sheer audacity of his choice, when I heard it. The familiar, insistent roar of high-end engines, followed by the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut, and the distinctive sound of expensive shoes walking up the dilapidated wooden stairs of my building. I stood up slowly, walked to my door and opened it, my breath catching in my throat. Dante Moretti was standing right there, in front of my door, dressed in a simple, high-quality dark sweater and jeans, looking exactly like the man who had first invaded my life, except his eyes, for the first time, were completely free of fear or calculation. They were simply warm, focused, and home. Behind him, exactly as on that very first chaotic afternoon, were dozens of boxes and a line of his now slightly confused bodyguards, filling the narrow hallway of my miserable apartment building, proving that even without the title, he still commanded respect. He smiled, a full, genuine, heart-stopping smile that reached his eyes, and he said the one line that made me burst into tears, the sudden, overwhelming relief washing away months of fear, humiliation, and sorrow. "I'm your roommate again, only this time it's forever. We're doing this your way, Lila." He had chosen love over power, and that decision not only saved my life, but finally saved his own. It was a long road back to normalcy, to paying off the loans, to finishing vet school. But we did it together. Two people from two completely different worlds, finding peace in the quiet dignity of a shared, ordinary life, free from the crushing weight of a crown he never wanted. I never did become Madame Moretti, the queen of the dark underworld, but I became something far better. Lila Torres, his partner, his safe harbor, and the woman who taught the most feared man in the world what it meant to choose a simple life over a complicated kingdom. I was never small, never insignificant, even when they shouted me down and judged me. I just needed the right kind of light to see my own strength, and the right partner to walk away from his old world and stand with me in mine. This is the kind of truth you carry with you. You realize that the world can try to shrink you down, try to tell you that you don't belong, but what you carry inside, that quiet, resilient fire, is what truly defines you. You were never small. You were never unimportant. You were just waiting for your moment to stand firm. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.